let's get to the big story, the big political and energy story of the day. Now, healthcare, energy and resource development are going to be high on the priority list when Canada's 13 provincial and territorial leaders meet in Halifax this week for the Premier's Summit. Saskatchewan has been in the spotlight lately. We're joined now by the Premier, Brad Wall, ahead of the meeting. Premier, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Andrew.
We're going to be talking pipelines, but we don't want this important story to get lost in the shuffle. You plan at the meeting to introduce proposal for Canadian healthcare going forward over the next decades. Could you give us the salient points of what you're calling for?
Sure, that's right. The premiers have asked Premier Ghiz and I to co-chair a working group of health ministers to come up with some real specific actions around clinical practice guidelines, scope of practice, health human resources, which remains the largest part of our respective health budgets, to come up with some specific recommendations for premiers to implement in their jurisdictions right across Canada that will place a priority on obviously better care for patients, but also better value and the chance to bend the cost curve a little bit. And you know, we haven't had a lot of time to do the work. We didn't want it just to be another report that might collect dust on a shelf. We wanted actionable, specific things, and I won't scoop the report when it's released here in the next, in the next couple of days. But I think we've got that. I think we've got some specifics. We've also identified some work together we can do as provinces on the purchase of generic drugs, and we've identified a couple of issues moving forward if the premiers decide to let this process continue, where we can seek better care again and hopefully begin to bend that cost curve in healthcare, which is very significant.
Well, Premier, let's move on to pipelines. A rift has emerged between BC and Alberta. BC is saying we would like a fair share of the proceeds from the wealth created by this Northern Gateway pipeline. Alberta has shut that idea down. Do you think this difference can be resolved?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. We have concerns. 4 of the 5 conditions, if we want to call them that BC announced yesterday seem reasonable. The 5th one we have a problem with as well. We obviously export a lot of our products through the Asia-Pacific Gateway. Those products head west. And although BC has said, look, this is different because it's bitumen, these things set precedents, of course, and the thin edge of the wedge is a bit of a concern for us as well. We support Alberta's position that the royalties belong to the owners of the resource, in this case the people of Alberta, and in the case of potash or oil in our province, the people of Saskatchewan. If there's going to be an additional benefit for the people of BC and environmental risk mitigation, something that's reasonable perhaps, that should be, we think that should probably be the companies that are providing that in the business case, either the pipeline company and or those on the other side who are producing it. One final point, if I may, there's some information in the backgrounders we saw from British Columbia which we think are factually incorrect. They intimate that we're producing oil sands, that we're already exploiting this asset. We have the potential for it, but so far there's been no economic case for our particular geology around oil sands in the Northwest. There's also a number they put on the benefit that we will get from the pipeline if it ever is approved, and we've never been asked about it. We don't know if the value is right. We have some doubts about the number actually, and I think that calls into question some of this. But there's a principle at work here that's of concern. We can be a leader in this world that wants energy security and food security, because these are strengths of our country, but only if we can get those things to market. Yes, in an environmentally sustainable way, but we need to get them to market. And if each province is now potentially going to hold projects up until they get a share of another province's royalty revenue, if that is a precedent, that's a concern.
It does open up a major barrel of worms, never mind a can of worms, doesn't it?
Well, it does. Again, in the case of Saskatchewan, we move 20% of the world's uranium that's mined in our province, and it has to. We have no nuclear power plants. There's not the economic case for that in our province, so we export that yellow cake. The same is true for potash. Of course, the same is true for prolific agriculture production that occurs in the province. And while we've heard BC say, well, this is different because it's bitumen, again, this is a precedent-setting condition that's been placed on another province's approval for a project, and we're concerned. We support Alberta's position. The environmental issues and the benefit sharing, perhaps, call it what you will. There's a reasonable discussion to be held, I think, and perhaps the companies should be involved in that. But for some reason, this position pits British Columbia against the people of Alberta, and on a de facto basis against the people of other jurisdictions that export through those ports. And by the way, there's a great economic benefit that's been derived over well over 100 years because certain provinces, certain places have access to ports in this country. Others don't. Others are landlocked. We have no prospects of having a port in Saskatchewan anytime soon. And so I think it's important that we recognize that the strength of this country and our ability to lead in economic stability, a world where it's not that stable right now, it's dependent on us being able to answer food security and energy security questions by getting product to market. That's good for the whole country, notwithstanding where the resource is actually located.
Premier, I was speaking with Premier Clark earlier today, and I asked her if all those 5 conditions were met, specifically on the fair share, resource, royalty, or whatever the payment that she wanted is met. She said they would essentially block it.
I think there's constitutional issues there. I mean, I'm not a constitutional expert. I think it's Section 121 speaks to the importance of interprovincial commerce and trade, but you know, I'm not sure where that takes us, and speculating on it's probably not particularly helpful, but neither, frankly, was that 5th condition put on unilaterally. I mean, there were discussions between the province of Alberta and the province of BC in advance of their release, and I met with Premier Clark last week as well, and we had a phone call, and I think there was an understanding where Alberta and Saskatchewan stood, and you know, this is unfortunate. I think we could work our way through this. There are other options, by the way, again, going back to the companies themselves, both the pipeline company and those on the other side, that would stand to benefit from being able to access that Brent price. The differential exists, of course, in terms of the oil prices we receive in Canada versus what might be available, and so I'm not sure about the specifics of the business case of the pipeline, but is there a discussion worth having with the companies, perhaps, in terms of what BC should expect to mitigate environmental risk and to share in some additional benefit? You know, sure. But to sort of bypass that opportunity and say to the people of Alberta, we want a cut of your royalties before we can give approval, notional or otherwise, that's not particularly helpful, again, to the economic prospects for the country, which will always depend on access to markets.
Could we move on? Because I know a lot of people want to hear what you think of CNOOC's takeover of Nexen. Obviously, you resisted the takeover of Potash Corporation. Should we be concerned? Should we look closely at this takeover of Nexen? It's a chunk of our oil sands more of our oil sands going into Asian hands.
It's a $15 billion deal. We should look closely at it. That's what's prescribed in the Investment Canada legislation, and I don't know the details of it, so that's the caveat I would throw out initially. I would just say that there is a sometimes seemingly vague but a pretty liberating metric in all of this that we found to be quite useful during both the potash situation and the Viterra situation. Both two takeovers with different results in terms of the Investment Canada process. And that metric is net benefit. And I understand the federal minister has said, look, it's up to the companies and the stakeholders here to demonstrate to Canadians how this is good, how there's a net benefit. You know, our measure in that was sort of production jobs, corporate office jobs, revenue for, in our case, the province and the country on the potash side and on Glencore. And, you know, you can find your way to a pretty clear analysis there. So I think that I'd leave it at that, but I'd say the net benefit test is frankly helpful. We said the Potash Corp was strategic because it controlled up to around a third of the world's potash reserves. I'm not sure that's the case with Well, I know it's not the case with Nexen, obviously, but it's a significant oil sands player.
At the risk of wading into politics, Premier, I know you're on the conservative end of the spectrum. This takeover of Nexen is a takeover by the Communist Party, essentially. I mean, they call the shots on CNOOC. Does that mean we should apply special rigor? I mean, it's always political when you have a communist-led government like Beijing. It's not a democratic state taking over an oil company in Canada.
You know, we have a relationship with state-owned enterprises in China as well in the province, and I do think it's an eyes-wide-open proposition. It certainly should be. But this is the way things are in that fast-growing economy, and even when they're backing up economically, it's 8% growth and a huge market for what Canada has to offer. So some circumspection, I think, is absolutely essential because this is different in terms of who the shareholders of the company looking to do the takeover are or is, who the shareholder is. Still, though, we need to balance that against the fact that, by and large, the Chinese, when involved in the resource sector in the country to date, certainly our experience is positive. This is a reality in the world. So yeah, the measure perhaps needs to be a little bit different. There needs to be some caution perhaps, but this is a reality that the whole world is dealing with in terms of the nature of who owns these enterprises in China.
Premier, thank you so much for giving us this time today. And we'll be watching closely. It's going to be fascinating to hear what you do propose on healthcare this week.
Thanks for your time. Have a good day.
Our guest has been Brad Wall, the Saskatchewan Premier. He joined us from Halifax.